Welcome to day 2 of the kickoff conference of the Evidence-Based Institute of Rutgers University School of Criminal Justice and Law School. The Evidence-Based Institute is a joint project of the School of Law on the Newark campus and the School of Criminal Justice. And we have as our purpose to bring evidence, the quality of evidence about practices in the criminal justice system to the state of New Jersey and upgrade and strengthen the evidence capacity in the state of New Jersey. There's a message from the director in your materials you picked up, and you've also got bios about the speakers and some background about the Institute. I want to make a couple of quick introductions. I want to introduce Dr. Michael Osterman. Mike is the director of the Evidence-Based Institute, and his hands are, you'll see the results of his work in everything that happens for the rest of the day. Also, I think she's back in the back, Dr. Shanique Thomas, just back. She is a research assistant professor in the Institute and also one of the people who helped to arrange this conference. Today is day 2, as I said. How many of you were here yesterday? Okay, so you know the drill. We are talking about evidence. How many of you are here for the first time today? Just a handful. I'm going to clue you in. Our purpose really is to think about evidence writ broadly as an idea that should be a motivating idea in the justice system. It is the perfect word to talk about a partnership between the practice of criminal justice and juvenile justice and a university. Universities are in the evidence business. We produce it, we consume it, and we critique it. But the practicing profession of criminal and juvenile justice are in the evidence business too. Not only do you consume it, you also produce it. Our hope is, and our plan is, to grow this partnership between the university's Evidence-Based Institute and the practices of justice in the private and public sectors in the state of New Jersey, so that the evidence basis for what we do is stronger, more robust, and more vibrant. We have a lot of ideas about how to do that, but the first idea was really let's have a conference, open up people from the state and announce who we are and start a conversation. And so that's what we did yesterday. One of the most important debates in the evidence business is about gender relevance of the current state of evidence in the justice evidence arena. We have today, and I'll introduce them more later, we have today some of the most important thinkers about that question in the world to talk to us about evidence and gender. And so I hope we have a useful and productive day. Your first assignment, however, is to ask questions. You'll note that on your table there are pencils and 3x5 cards, or maybe 4x6 cards. I'd like for each of you to take a moment, grab a pencil and a paper and one of those little cards, and write down a question you would like to ask coming in about this theme today, which is gender and evidence. We will comb through them and use them throughout the day to ask questions of our speakers. But the second rule is, as stuff is happening and you say, wow, that provokes a question in me, feel free to scribble that question down and bring it up here to this table right here where we'll be sitting, and we will try to weave as many questions into the conversation today as we can. So just take a minute right now, grab a pencil and a card and write down a question for us to take a look at. Thanks. We are fortunate today to have people who have dedicated their careers to thinking about this question of gender and the justice system. Now, the folks we have who are speaking to us don't only work in this area, they have broad expertise across a number of areas, but they are known nationally and internationally for their particularly thoughtful work on the issue of gender and criminal justice and juvenile justice. You have their bios in your book, so I'm not going to read them to you. But I'm going to tell you that Barbara Owen, our first speaker, is one of the most beloved experts on justice in the field. She is in tremendous demand. People she just was telling me that she teaches one semester, she teaches half a year now so that she can spend the other half of the year traveling around doing things like talking to groups like us. Her work on women's prisons has been noted as some of the most important descriptions of the problems women face in incarceration. She's also authored important books, important reports that detail some of the problems of applying strategies based on male offenders to people involved in women involved in the criminal justice system. We are delighted to have her. She's going to give an address, and then she's going to be responded to by one of our own faculty members, Dr. Bonnie Vesey. Bonnie has been one of the most important people in my transition to this dean's job, because she had the dean's job before me, and almost all of the problems that I inherited had been cut in half by her own work in a short period of time that she was doing that job. She is active throughout the state of New Jersey on issues related to mental health and corrections, and if you have an operating criminal justice agency, you have worked with Bonnie Vesey. She has been a consultant to your organization. She has helped you solve problems. She's particularly interested in issues of gender, but her work travels broadly across other issues in the corrections system. So I will turn the podium over to Dr. Barbara Owen, who is our speaker, and then Bonnie will respond to her comments.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's nice to know I'm beloved by somebody. In a lot of places, not so much. I've been doing work in prisons for many, many years. I started out my career as a person. I started out my academic career as an art history major. I thought I was going to live in Paris and be groovy and sit in cafes and wear the beret. And I mean, that was really my life plan. And, you know, sometimes I think time's ticking, time to get back to that world. I studied art history, loved art history. I can kind of remember some of that stuff from my early days. But somewhere along my undergraduate career, I took a Soc 1 class. How many people have taken Soc 1? Well, it changed my life. Oh my gosh, norms, rules, institutions, deviance. I said, this is what I think about all the time. So I switched from being an art history major, and not any real regrets. Actually, my husband, who's also an artist, he's a jazz piano dude, he plays piano, and the other day he said, honey, when they write the story of your life as an artist, there's going to be a sentence in there that says, and for a strange 25-year period, she was a criminologist. So you're in here, you're here as in part of the strange 25 years that I'm a criminologist. As Todd said, I've done a lot of thinking about women and girls in the criminal justice system. I got my PhD at Berkeley, fancy school, fancy talk, you know, the state, the theory of the state. And I kept saying, state, California, Missouri, what state are they talking about? It took me a while to, you know, realize it was the state that they were talking about. But while I was at Berkeley, I worked on my dissertation like we all do, and I decided to study correctional officers. So there I was, a little 23-year-old graduate student. In those days, you know, we didn't shave our legs and stuff like that. Knocking on the door of San Quentin saying, hi, will you let me in? Can I come and study your correctional officers? It took a year and a half for them to approve my study. I got an NIJ fellowship along the way, and I really think that's the only reason they let me in. And I look back now and I think, that was kind of nervy, knocking on the door of San Quentin saying, hello, can I come in? I was hanging around the tiers. I was talking to correctional officers. And again, I look back and I go, oh, well, that's interesting. Well, right after that, I went to work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And in those days, in the good old days, the Bureau had research analysts in the facilities. So for a couple of years, I worked in a medium secure male prison as a researcher. And it was the best job in the whole world, because not only that story about access to get into San Quentin, but as my fellow and sister researchers know, it's hard to get in sometimes. I had a badge. They let me in every day. I did some very interesting studies, and I really grasped how prisons work from, you know, going in every day. So I know about key control, and, you know, I know about searching every now and then, for those of you who work in facilities, we'd have the massive search, and all the inmates have to line up, and of course, all the fellows wanted me to search them. No, not so much. So that was kind of my first little men, women, prisons. What's that like? Then the Bureau transferred me to central office, where I worked in Washington, D.C., and I think that's really where I became a researcher, working at real-world problems. What were the kinds of things the Bureau faced, and I still am the Bureau, the Bureau of Prisons faced every day, and how could research help answer those questions? How could the kinds of things that we talked about yesterday, and I took a lot of notes, even on my own presentation, how can evidence and policy analysis help us do our jobs better, help us understand this thing called recidivism, and I have some things to say about recidivism here in a second, and how can social science research help us assess these outcomes, both in a kind of selfish reason. When I worked in a facility, we did not like it so much when someone, escaped. It was kind of a medium. People could kind of leave if they wanted. Or if there was something yucky, a fire, any of those kinds of things. So from that experience working for the Bureau of Prisons, I think I gained an appreciation of how social science, how this thing we call evidence, again, in its most broadest form, how information collected through rigorous social science techniques, how information analyzed through these types of methodology can help us not only do our jobs better, not only make our agencies or our facilities run better, but if you all go back in your own past about how you got in this seat and not some others, how it is that we really can make our communities better. Because I just have to feel at basis, even though I can just be as cynical as anybody, if you really think about how you came here, we all come back to the question of we really thought we were going to make the world better. Anybody kind of remember feeling like that at some point? Oh, I see some smiles. I knew some of my tables were going to come through for me. So, as Todd said, I've been thinking a lot about girls and women in the criminal justice system. I was in Washington, D.C. for a while, and it was really a wonderful experience in a lot of ways. For those of you who are interested in prison riots, a book that we put together, a bunch of research analysts on the Cuban riots in 1987. Anybody remember those Cuban riots? I had the privilege, even though it sounds weird, I interviewed all the staff hostages after they were released about their experience in a riot, and that book's out now. It took, 87 to now? You figured out how many years it took. Gotta love those FOI, requests for information with the federal government. But after I left the Bureau, I came back to California and was looking at riots, looking at drug treatment, done a lot of research on drug treatment in prisons, different kinds of things. Someone in my department came up and said, hey, they're building a women's prison down the street. Let's go look at it. And that really, truly changed the course of my career. So when we look at the question of gender, when we think about what gender means, it's not just that these measures have been stable over time in our Western, our U.S. criminal justice criminology work. They seem to be stable around the world. When I first made the slides for this presentation, I had like 300. And then Bonnie said, not so much. And then I cut them down. And she said, really? How long are you going to talk? So I've cut a lot of these out. But I did have a lot of stuff about what things look like on an international basis. So that's a long preamble, and I'll really get to the good stuff here. Our good friend Kay Harris, a professor at Temple, asked us to think about this. If gender did not matter, our prisons, our jails, our community corrections would be 51% female and 49% male. Why? Because that's what it looks like in the general population. Anybody got 51% women in their prisons, in their parole, in their probation? Probably not. So, if this is the case, we need to think about theory and data and findings on improving outcomes to understand the ways in which gender affects our operational practice and more broadly, our outcomes. When we look at the characteristics and offenses of girls and women, as I just said, they haven't changed that much. And again, internationally, they don't seem to be that different. There's something about being a female, whether it's a juvenile female, whether it's an adult female, there's something about female in the world that creates, that shapes, that contributes to what I call pathways. And the pathway perspective frames these experiences, frames the path that girls and young women travel to the justice system, and I think helps us understand not only how they got there, how they behaved while under supervision, and equally important, allows us to think about opportunities for intervention. Several years ago, again, it's amazing how long we've been doing this, the National Institute of Corrections worked with me and my two colleagues, Barbara Blue and Stephanie Covington, to develop what's called gender-responsive strategies. And I'm quite proud to say that the gender-responsive strategies approach became the foundation for the National Institute of Corrections Women's Services Program. And when Pat talks later today, she'll talk a little bit about how her work has been supported by NIC and that particular point of view, and I'll give you some more details on that. We do feel very strongly that the empirical evidence comes in every day that shows addressing these pathways, creating interventions around the realities of the lives of girls and young women, not only improves outcomes for them, but in the long run improves outcomes for communities. How many of you are familiar with the microloan programs that the UN and other international foundations, who do they loan the money to? Women. Why? Why don't they loan it to the dudes? Because they go gamble and do other things with it. There's an enormous amount of evidence in the international arena that these very small loans help women create industries that feed their families. And so when we think about that investment around the world in these poor countries, I think it calls into the question of what kind of investment are we making in girls and women in our system. Okay, overview. Again, these things were stable. They're stable in the studies I and my colleagues did in the early 90s. They're stable in the kind of things that Bonnie and Pat are going to talk about in some of the studies I'm going to summarize for you together. Again, you all know this. Your women offenders generally fit this profile. Understanding any of our offenders, male or female, brings us to the context of poverty, unemployment, and undereducation. Men have those things too. And here's the thing about gender responsive, if you remember anything that I say today, men have gender too. In my more current writings, I talk about women-centered issues because I think gender responsive, it's kind of become the code word for women, right? But men have gender too, and so you can take these ideas about what does it look like to be poor when you're a man, to be unemployed, to be undereducated. And I think you'll all see that these things mean different things for females, mean different things for males. But today we're here to talk about women and girls. They come from fragmented families. A woman in prison is much more likely to have family members in prison than a man in prison. They come from families, girls and women are much more likely to come from families where drug and alcohol and mental health are problems. The term I use a lot is multiple marginality. Again, remember that sociology that kind of got me out of the art galleries into rooms like this. Remember in sociology, we learned about conventional institutions and how we get socialized. We get socialized with the family. We get socialized through schools. We get socialized through work, right? Those are the things that put you in these seats. You are in the center of conventional institutions. Well, when you think about marginality, girls and young women are more likely to leave school at a young age. They're more likely to run away. They're more likely to not work. That image of being on the margin of conventional institutions in multiple ways explains from a sociological point of view some of the pathways that women take to the justice system. Minorities are overrepresented in almost every category. Minorities are overrepresented around the world. It doesn't matter whether you're in Canada, it doesn't matter whether you're in China, it doesn't matter where you are. The disadvantaged class shows up in prison and jail populations, and that's quite true for women and girls. Women and girls seem to have more physical and mental health challenges. And I know so much of Bonnie's work has investigated what trauma looks like. But here's the new kind of wave. Here's the new work that I hope a lot of young earnest graduate students are doing out there, looking at the role of trauma and violence in the lives of boys. My colleague Stephanie Covington talks about trauma in a lot of different ways. And one of the most compelling things she says is that when they're young, boys and girls are at more or less the same risk in the home for violence. The differences start to emerge, things start to diverge as they get older. As boys become young men and get bigger, they're less prone to violence in the family, they're more prone to violence outside the family. But girls and young women stay at risk for violence within their families. This whole dating violence stuff, there's new figures out. It used to be about 1 in 5 young women was in some kind of domestic violence relationship with her boyfriend. This new study just out says 1 in 3. I've got a niece who's 15. I heard about this study at another conference Pat and I were in Salt Lake City a couple of days ago. I'm calling up my 15-year-old niece and asking her some hard questions. Let's talk about this boyfriend of yours. Well, what do you guys do and what goes on? I had no idea that the domestic violence issue was going on in these teen relationships to this degree. When we talk about trauma, I've learned, and I'm a sociologist, I'm a psychologist, but I've learned that trauma is the injury sustained through violence. And there's all kinds of new work about chemical issues like high cortisol levels, and reach the extent of my understanding in neurobiology right there, as well as some idea that Bonnie and I have been kicking around, how abuse and the trauma that follows it really changes the way you think about yourself. So think about this. If you are being inappropriately sexually touched by someone who's not supposed to, if you're too young, if it's a family member, if it's a trusted family friend, what does that make you think about the world? Fathers are supposed to take care of you. My father's hurting me. Brothers are supposed to look after you. My brother's not doing that. Play out those scenarios in your own head and think about how crazy making that is. The person who's supposed to love you is hurting you. Well, what does that do? And it's and again, I'm just kind of making this up. It's a new idea I've been kicking around lately. We remember learning about cognitive dissonance in sociology 101, or in psychology, but this idea, your meaning worlds don't work. You have to hide it, you have to go to school and keep it secret. Keeping secrets is a real hard thing to do. I think we're just beginning to understand how trauma not only shapes experiences, but shapes your meaning systems. And that's a lecture for another time to go into the whole meaning world, meaning system. But we do know that these features shape the lives of girls and women in our system. I called up my good friend Alan Beck, who's the second smartest man in the world. For those of you who don't know Alan, he's the head of the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Essentially, they do censuses of inmates. And in 1999, the BJS folks put out a bulletin on women in the criminal justice system. So you can tell I'm kind of nervy, so I called him up. When I was asked to come here, and I said, Alan, how come there's no more? We need a bulletin on this. And he goes, well, I don't know, we're going to do this. I said, all right, you better put it on your list. And he said, well, here's some of the things that you can look at that I kind of knew already, but I pretended that Tommy knew stuff. If you look at the latest reports from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, you see something kind of cool, that prison rates are slowing. They're still going up, but they're not up crazy like they were in the 90s and in the first part of this decade. But look at that second point. It's the males, it's the dudes that are showing the sharpest decline in the increase. One of the things we've been saying for what, Pat, the last 15 years, that women are increasing at disproportionate rates. Interestingly enough, disproportionate to their rates of increase in arrest, and that's a whole another story. But the men are starting to decline, the women still inching up a little bit. The good news is New Jersey has a very different picture, and I'll show you some numbers on that here in a second. Again, you know all these kinds of things. The prison system nationally is 93% male. Again, going back to, wait a minute, it should be 49% male, shouldn't it, if gender didn't matter? So clearly something's going on with gender that brings more men and boys into the system, fewer girls and young women. In 2000, that should be a comma there were just about 93,000 women locked up in state prisons overall. In 2009, you see it's increasing somewhat. But look at New Jersey, and anybody who has anything to do with it, sit there and go, yay for me. New Jersey's one of the, I think about the 8 states that's showing a decline in their state women's population. In 2000, about 1,600. In 2009, just over 1,200. So yay, something's going on here. I looked at a report called Hard Hit that's done by the Women's Prison Association and right across the river in New York, and looked at some of their data about New Jersey's women in prison. So you can see from this little march through the calendar that in 1977, New Jersey had 180 women in prison. You got a little wild, almost over 20 years later, but your figures are starting to decline. One of the things criminologists talk about is rates. So in New Jersey, 33 out of every 10,000 women are in prison. And again, the good news here is that look at how low you are. You are one of the 10 least punitive states for women when you look at things from a national point of view. So I think that gives us a place to start and think about, okay, what accounts for this and what else can we do about it? When you look at national data on women in prison, and these numbers are different for weird statistical reasons, you see that white women still are the majority, but does anybody know what proportion African Americans are, what percentage of the general population? 12 or 13%. Twice that in our nation's prisons. Hispanic is the biggest growing percentage. When I first started looking at that, particularly in California, Hispanic were under 10%, but they're growing all the time. The other thing I want you to look at is the offense category. Over the last 20 years, the proportion of violent offenders has gone up. But here's the thing that's really important. That percentage, that slice has gone up because fewer states are sending women to prison for the lower level offenses. 10 years ago, you added property and drug offenses together. They were like 75% of the population around the country. Not the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Bureau, 85% of their offenders are drug offenders in the federal system. But for state prisons, there's a bigger proportion. Well, now you're seeing laws, policies changing of not sending the lower level offenders. California, when I first started studying it 15 years ago, you would get 3 years for petty theft with a prior. That's shoplifting. We don't send those women to prison so much in California. But just to know, don't do anything we do in California. I think our motto should be CDCR, everything we do is wrong. If anybody wants to talk to me about this afterwards, they're sending low-level offenders to county jails now. Yay, for as long as 10 years, yay! What's that going to be, having people in jail for 10 years? We're insane. Don't do what we do. So my point is the number, the percentage, proportion of violent offenders is growing Not in terms of numbers, but in terms of percentage, because those lower level offenders are being pulled out. Does that make sense to you? So don't look at this and say, oh, wait a minute, they used to be 20%. Women are getting more violent. No, they're the lower end folks. Women are getting pulled out. When we look at data on probation and parole, see that overall, women are 24% of those on probation, and it would make sense about 12% of those on parole, because they're 10 to 12% of prison populations. When we look at the offenses of women on probation and parole, you see very different pictures, and that kind of makes sense. You get probation for the lower level offenses, you go to prison for the more serious kinds of offenses. Another way to look at it that I think I took out of these slides is that when you look at all women and girls under any form of criminal justice supervision, almost 85% of them are on some form of community supervision. So community supervision, I think, gives us a real opportunity to think about these interventions earlier on in their pathways before they get to prison. I'm going to talk just a little bit about girls. It sounds silly, but it's important to think about. And then as when we study women in prison, we have to remember before they were women, they were girls. And so what is it about girls' lives, about girls' pathways, that we can understand, again, in thinking about intervention? And I think, and I can't remember who it was one of the panelists at the end of the table yesterday who talked about more investment in juvenile services. The guy from Washington State talked about more investment in juvenile services. And I'm here to tell you, I'm all for that, but that doesn't mean we need to take away from the adult facilities, because they're still there. So they don't just disappear. Now, hopefully over time, these juvenile interventions will show some impact on lower prison rates. But it's important to look at the girls' issue. So again, girls are not 51% of those detained or those incarcerated, and every state calls it different things. Detained, committed means different things in different states. The interesting thing about girls is they are 40% of all status offenders. And again, this audience knows a status offender is someone who breaks a law that's illegal for a kid to do, but not for us to do. 55% of the girls and young women locked up are youth of color, as well as looking at their offense categories. Now, I don't want to lose you in this because it sounds like statistic talk. There is a demonstrated rise in simple assaults in girl populations. We are seeing it in a lot of states that the number of girls and young women confined for simple assault seems to be going up. Nita Chesney-Lynn, our colleague in Hawaii, and other folks have two explanations for this. One is the mandatory arrest and domestic violence incidents. The top two victims of girls' simple assault. Who wants to guess who it is? Their mom and their boyfriend's other girlfriend. In California, last time we looked at the profile of what used to be the California Youth Authority, now it's the Division of Juvenile Justice, and next week they're going to call it Lunatic Land. That's the other thing we do in California. We just change the names of things so nobody pays attention to what's going on. Last time we did a profile of girls in our state prison, training school kind of thing, there was a huge number of girls who had assaulted other pregnant girls. That's kind of bad. We are not supposed to be assaulting pregnant women. Well, what do you think the story was? They'd been pregnant by their idiot boyfriend. So when you look at these kinds of things, it introduces something I'm going to call relational theory here in a second. But those simple assaults, they are rising. Assault with weapons are rising too. But again, careful analysis shows that the weapon of choice, if I can run up there and get mine, is a purse or a backpack. Young girls are smacking people in the head, well, I'm not gonna smack you, with their purse and their backpack. That would hurt, that kabongs, but it's not a knife, it's not a gun. But so when you see those figures about weapon use with girls and young women, ask what kind of weapon and who is the victim. Girls are much more likely to be sent, as I said, for status offenses, but also technical violations. Lots of research on girls out there that looks at their pathways. They're young, obviously they wouldn't be juveniles. The history of victimization of girls in the system seems to be high on lots of different measures. Not doing well in school, and a lot of running away. One of the things we say about running away is girls usually run away from something and boys run to something. So these combine to create our juvenile female population. I mentioned the pathways perspective. The pathways perspective is the best way that I can think about understanding how girls and young women come into the justice system. Here for a second. Here's a couple of the basic tenets of understanding pathways. The first is that women and girls' crimes are embedded in the conditions of their own lives. We need to look at how they're situated in terms of these conventional institutions of family, of school, of work, of church, of recreation, those kinds of things. The pathways perspective is very related to what more mainstream criminology calls life course events, looking at turning points, looking at specific things that happen that place women and girls at risk for offending. My colleague Barbara Bloom has contributed the idea of triple jeopardy. When we look at women and girls who are in the justice system, understanding the interaction of class, race, and gender, and how that shapes pathways. I've already talked about my multiple marginality stuff, and my colleague Stephanie Covington, who talks a lot about trauma and addiction. The last point there is this notion of relationships. I just want to point something out to you. You had 2 male speakers yesterday. Did any of them go around the tables in the morning and say, how you doing, table 15? I'm expecting some energy from you. Did you see that happen? Women want to connect in ways different than men do. Do you agree with that? Yes. That I have probably touched 3 or 4 of you already today. I want to know about you. I want to know where you came from. I want to know what you're doing. I want to know if you're interested. I want to know if you're making a grocery list. There's just a lot of stuff I want to know. And in terms of these relationships, in terms of wanting some connection, this has a lot of implications for their paths to crime. I mentioned that my next study, if I can stay home and start thinking about it, is looking at women lifers. And I'm going to bet, I don't know, I'm just making this up, so don't write this down, because I don't have any evidence for it yet. I'm going to bet that women who are in my state in California, we just have about 1,000 lifers, as I can say. You have to kill somebody to get life, pretty much, in California. I'm going to bet that a huge proportion of women killed an abusive partner of some kind or another. Another big clump committed the crime with a male co-defendant. I know for a fact all the women on death row, I think we have 18 now in California, all had male co-defendants. And another small part probably killed a kid or something yucky. Does that kind of make sense, what you know about your female lifers? Very different. Almost all of those have what? A relational aspect. And that's kind of an extreme, kind of grisly example. But I think it illustrates the idea that understanding women, creating evidence-based interventions, calls into relationships. Ask us have to think about this. I also think a lot of the risk situations that girls and young women get into are relational. Go back to that example of the rise in simple assaults for girls their mom or the girlfriends of their boyfriend sounds kind of relational to me. So pathways research, something I've been talking about a long time, something I've been looking at a long time. Well, you know, when you get old like me, you want to pretend like, okay, yeah, I already wrote that, I don't have to think about it anymore. But I wanted to think about it for you, I wanted to know more. So I, like a good student, did a search, and I found the current pathways research that's mostly embedded in dissertations right now. A study by Picard talks about victimization as a risk factor for crime, and talks about the psychological and health functioning aspects of women's pathways, and makes the argument that many people make. Again, these things are stable, they're not changing that much over time. As we get more and more layers of evidence, we're finding out it's more and more true, and that is there's a cumulative impact. Multiple trauma, multiple victimization is a key risk factor for girls and young women. Kavita looked at the question of recidivism, race, and desistance. She too emphasizes the community context. Where are these girls and women coming from? What do we know about these neighborhoods? She talks about the relational aspect of criminal involvement and the role of drug use, particularly in coping with life events. Some of the slides I had to take out because I did have a bill with them, was talking about the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Event Studies. Anybody familiar with those? This was a big study done. Thank you, Pat, for being familiar with that. This was the original ACE study was a giant study done on thousands of people in the community, non-criminal justice populations, and asked them two kinds of questions. What kind of yucky things happened to them when they were young? Abuse, assault, family dysfunction, bunches of things. And then asked them to name some of the stuff that was going on in their adult life. Well, my colleagues at UCLA, Nina Messina and Chris Grella, replicated that questionnaire on a sample of women who had just left prison. And again, I don't have the slides here, but in some cases, well, in all cases, the female prison population, ones who just left prison, had much higher rates of these adverse childhood events across the board, and had astoundingly much higher rates of bad things going on in their adult lives. Suicide, disease, of course criminal involvement, psychological problems, all kinds of health problems. So this notion of negative life events, when you look at the ACE data, when you think about it in terms of a pathway, it draws a picture, I hope, in your head of what happens in their lives and how it intersects with criminal and juvenile justice involvement. Kavita also introduced an idea that, quite frankly, I think is like the next thing for us to think about, and that's the notion of human and social capital, and I'll get to some definitions here in a second. Tim Brennan, and I don't know how to say that other guy's last name, so just look at it, Rittenback, looked at, what was it, Pat, about 900 cases in the California prison system, and I think they're both guys, they too identified these causal processes that occur together, that come together. Again, think about pathways and what feeds these pathways, what shapes behavior, to produce, gosh, what they had, like 11 different pathways. It was kind of confusing for being a non-statistician to read, but they too are finding evidence of pathways. And they also talk about something that Pat's going to talk much more about, looking at the different kind of variables that predict risk. Emily Salisbury, one of Pat's graduate students, also looked at the pathways issues, and she took a sample of women on probation, right? I'm kind of nervous with her dissertation supervisor, and you're like, oh God, what if I got wrong? Emily Salisbury also talks about the importance of social capital, and we'll talk about that here in a second. She combines one aspect of pathway theory, the relationships, with the notion of resources. And again, adds, I think, to our understanding. Again, talks about the impact of abuse factors, and she talks about how outcomes are mediated by social and psychological factors. So, everybody needs a job, right? You need jobs, I need jobs, we all need jobs. Offenders need jobs, whether they're probation, whether they're just out of prison, we need a job. That's just how it works in our society. But this is what she found that I just found so compelling. That yes, increasing social capital, education, vocation, improving people's skills in that way, really produce the best outcomes when 3 other things were improved. Family reintegration, improved relationships, and I always have trouble saying this word, self-efficacy. So it wasn't just enough to send people to school, wasn't just enough to get people job training. All that messy stuff in their relational life had to have some intervention as well. We were talking before we started about different funders and projects that we've submitted, and had to be a little bent that some of our projects weren't funded, because of course we think everything we do is fascinating. And I remember that a long time ago, I submitted a proposal looking at the role of domestic violence in parole revocation. And would you guess it's different for women and girls? Any parole agent people here ever have the wife of a male parolee call up and say, come over here and get him out of my house because he's beating me? Does that ever happen? And domestic violence for the men has a whole different outcome. For the women, it's usually a stressor and tumbles them down in terms of even becoming more marginal, using more drugs, etc. So when you look at Emily's finding there, that yes, increasing education and vocational skills, yep, everybody agree that? Our vendors need that? It has to be coupled with addressing these social, psychological variables as well. As I said, I've become more enchanted with this notion of social and human capital. And so in thinking about it, I kind of put it in 2 different categories. For human capital, it's, what do you know? How much education do you have? What are your job skills? How much experience do you have? Do you know one of the really interesting variables in a lot of outcome studies with offenders is time management? Did you see that idiot Lindsay Lohan on the news this morning? She couldn't manage to get to her community service job at the morgue on time. Think that young woman needs some time management? Think about time management. What makes you get here on time? What makes you show up? Time management is a human capital skill that makes us successful. Students ask me all the time, oh, you got a PhD. Oh my gosh, that must be, you're so smart. And I said, you know what, the one single thing, and all my PhD friends are gonna laugh when I say this, the one single thing that distinguishes PhD people from non-PhD people, we keep showing up. Every fall, I'm here, here's my pencils, I brought my books, let's go. We keep coming. So, human capital, what do you got that someone might want to pay for? Social capital, in my view, can be thought of, who do you know? Networking for jobs. I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but all of you have had some experience either in your own life or with your family's life of somebody getting a job because they know somebody. Does that happen in our world? Well, what if everybody you know is a dope fiend parolee and they only got one job to offer you? So this notion of social capital, emotional and financial support. I'm not going to ask you to raise hands, but I'm going to bet there's a majority of people in this room who are helping family members with money right now. Think so? And why can we do it? Because we have jobs. Oh, we've got education, skills, experience, time management. We've been showing up so we can help our friends and family. Well, what if all the people you know are in the same boat you are? And finally, and this was fascinating in a recent study, the National Institute of Corrections has created over time a lot of bulletins under the gender responsive banner. And I don't know if you've seen this one, Pat. A very smart person, whose last name was Flowers, I don't know who she is, put together the Women Offenders and Employment Bulletin. I urge you to look at that. It's fascinating. One study she talks about in that summary of the data is it's not only your needs. If you've got functioning families and functioning friends, when you fall apart, not only can they help you, they're not dragging you down. When everybody you know is a mess, and you know, I think about some of my personal issues. Am I running over time? You always get scared, like when the boss comes and gives you the look over here. When everything's going along and one person is slipping a little bit, we can reach down and help them, right? Think about, again, your friends and family. When we're all a mess, nobody can help anybody. So these two notions to me, and again, not exactly only applying to women and girls, but I think they play out differently. So social and human capital, I think, is a big area that we need to be thinking about in terms of intervention. So I've talked about gender responsiveness. What does gender responsiveness mean? My colleagues, Barbara Bloom and Stephanie Covington, have created this definition in different ways. People just, everybody who talks about these gender issues uses some of these same concepts. The most important thing I want to point out that anything that we conceive of or think about doing with women and girls needs to focus on their realities. What are their realities? Absolutely. We all wish Lindsay Lohan would show up in time for her very important job at the morgue. You wish your offenders would show up for their appointments. We wish they would stop using dope. We wish that they would quit having abusive boyfriends. We wish, we wish, we wish. How's that working for us? Not a whole lot of wishing comes to fruition. So understanding the realities and thinking about their realities as women, as girls, is what gender responsiveness means. It's based on three broad categories. One is the characteristics of women and girls and their pathways. Oh yeah, we already know that, yay. Based on how they differ from males. And understanding that a system responds to them differently. The work that I've been doing for the last 6 years, and it's kind of driving me a little bit crazy, is related to the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA. How many of you have to think about PREA in your jobs? You know, my new saying is it's the tail that wags the dog of correction these days. And we've been studying what sexual violence looks like in women's facilities. Do you think sexual violence for women is different than sexual violence for the dudes? Sure. I've got pages of studies to illustrate all that. We know that the system responds differently to women and girls. We know that in general, prisons, jails, probation, parole when they were designed to address the behavior of men and boys, and we just don't behave the same way. For example, some of this PREA stuff. One of the first responses in facilities is to get a rape kit and swab. Well, if it's a female on female assault, not exactly the same stuff to swab for, right? And just a total footnote here, that was the stupidest name law ever. It should have been called the Sexual Safety and Corrections Act, because I go to a lot of women's jails and prisons and they say, oh, women can't rape each other, so this law doesn't apply to us. And you go, well, it's not prison rape, it's sexual safety. Jails, they'll say, oh, prison doesn't apply to us. It applies to community corrections too. The standards are going to be coming out in January, and I'm sure you're all very excited to look at those. Gender responsiveness, the characteristics and pathways, how they differ from men, and how the system responds to them differently. Oh, I knew he was going to tell me. I'm going to go, the gender patterns are very different. Again, women's crimes are quite predominantly in these categories. Differences fall under community supervision. They respond very different to parole agents, to probation agents. Differences fall in custody. I'm going to get to the findings here in a second. Overall, here's the key differences. So the relational context. Another thing I hope I leave you as a takeaway. Understand how these relationships affect why women and girls commit crimes, how they behave, their motivations for change, and how they become reintegrated Race and ethnicity, huge discrepancies. We saw that in the earlier slide. I'm going to hop to, here's our basic principles. And again, I can send you all these in their longer issues, but these are our basic principles in thinking about being gender responsive. What I want to get to here real quickly are the recent findings. This is a conference about evidence-based. There is evidence, there's significant evidence that gender not only plays a part in the pathways to, in creating interventions, and the pathways from. When you look at the research findings, they're mixed. Gender itself might not be a predictor, but there's a lot of things that mediate in between that predict these outcomes. Those 4 things: co-occurring disorders, histories of abuse and trauma, social economic status, and parenting and child care responsibilities have enormous effect on recidivism and positive outcomes. Here's some women-centered programs that are evidence-based practice as judged by SAMHSA and all kinds of other different research studies. Again, I can give you all this material. When we talk about evidence, there's a lot of evidence that paying attention to pathways, that intervening in terms of trauma, in terms of relationship, these gender issues in terms of social and human capital, there's a lot of evidence. 3 NIDA studies show that very specific gender-based drug treatment shows vastly improved outcomes. I just have to tell you something really quick. In the Valley State Prison study, the staff did not want to unwrap the materials because they were too good to give to the women. So talking about fidelity, you've got notebooks, here they are. They were all shrink wrapped and kept in the closet because the women offenders would just lose them, the staff said. So you got to pay attention to how the program is being delivered. A review of that says 38 studies shows that these are the kinds of things that improved outcomes for women, all very gender-based. Female offender treatment, an employment program in California shows remarkable improvements in recidivism. And again, look at the issues of parenting and psychosocial functioning. Marilyn Van Deeken in Canada has created what's called the Women Offender Case Management Program. All these things are available on the NIC website. I think this is a very, very promising approach. It's gender-based. She operationalized gender-responsive principles into practice. It focuses on case management. And there's been one evaluation, 2 more are coming out, and this is yet. Look at this, social supports, parenting, self-efficacy. Those are protective factors that improve outcomes. It works, that's what that says. Another program Marilyn Van Deeken's developed called Moving On, same thing. Looks at the strengths, that's another aspect of gender responsive practice, a strength-based approach rather than a deficiency. She uses relational theory as well as some things that you hear in more traditional evidence-based practice. Their outcomes, again, are improved. Women who participate in that intervention do better than matched control groups of women who don't. Program participants had higher technical violation rates. How come? They're watching them closer. This is a reentry court in Los Angeles. It's just a huge project. It's a multi-million-dollar project. It's a consortium of all those agencies. Improved outcomes there. Again, you can kind of guess what these are. Reduced recidivism, but here's the slide that everybody loves to see. They calculated saving the prison years. California, we say it's about $46,000 a year to lock somebody up. How many prison years did they save? The grant was $1.2 million. They saved almost $9 million. So we're talking about the investment point of view. Drug courts, particularly for women in this case, show improvements. The last study I'm going to talk about, and I really will shut up, is a new book by our colleague Mary Morash And she compared what she called a traditional county and a gender-responsive county, a county that took all this stuff into account in developing their services for women. Again, what kind of services they need, how they provided them, using wraparound services to address both non-gender and gender needs. And the findings, again, social location, social networks, as well as choices influence these outcomes. Gender-responsive supervision, she said, supported improved outcomes. The officer's relationship, listening to women's feelings, addressing domestic violence issues, and supported peer groups. This study, to me, is a study of the process, not just a program, and I think it's a very important one. Here are the factors that produce these outcomes. And for you, those of you in probation and parole, it was a combination of law enforcement and a social work orientation that she feels contributed to these improved outcomes. So lots of improved outcomes here. Factors, relationships. She analyzed the relationships in these two counties and found out, again, professional barrier, boundaries, all those kinds of things, but that the relationships across the board improved in the gender-responsive county. So everybody's favorite line to conclude. Gender-responsive practice, gender-responsive research pays attention and acknowledges the differences between female and male offenders. We use data to make policies, to design programs, to make the case for gender-responsive programming. Of course, I'm going to pitch on our principles. We think they're very important in understanding this, but the ultimate goal is to improve outcomes. And the outcome studies I went through very quick here provide evidence, provide a basis for targeting programs and services to women and girls, for creating programs and services that target these pathways to improve outcomes, not only for women, but for their children and for their community. Thank you very much for listening to me.